So today, welcome to RJ Julia Booksellers. We have our hybrid system set up, so we are live. And so welcome to people also who are watching us virtually. I'm Kathy Santillo, and I'm part of the events team here at RJ Julia. And thank you for joining us. Here at the store, we have copies of this brand new book, which I'm showing more after the break, which is the author's first book, which is especially exciting. We'll have a signing immediately following, so please join us in the other room if you would like to stay for that. As I was preparing for tonight, I realized this evening here at RJ Julia Booksellers, we are all products of Connecticut. So that was something that I thought was particularly interesting as we talk about Connecticut and local and all that's going on. So first, let me introduce Jamie Roth, who will be in conversation with the author. Jamie Roth is an award-winning on-air news reporter who has worked for TV stations across the country. Over the past 20 years, Roth has covered major stories of national and local interest, reporting from both Hartford and New York City. She's also a freelance senior producer with Business Insider. Roth has taught at Columbia Graduate School of Journalism since 2014. She graduated with honors from Cornell University with a degree in American Studies. And now let's turn to Jen Maxfield and her first book, more after the break. A reporter returns to 10 unforgettable news stories published this month, July 2022. Jen Maxfield is an Emmy Award-winning reporter and anchor for NBC New York. Prior to joining the station in 2013, she worked for Eyewitness News for 10 years as a reporter and substitute anchor. Starting her broadcast career in Binghamton, New York, Maxfield worked in Syracuse before moving to New York City in 2002. My oldest daughter studied broadcast journalism actually at Syracuse University, so the Syracuse community is very special to our family. Maxfield is also an adjunct professor at the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University, and she teaches courses there, as you can imagine, broadcast journalism, including Video One and on-air skills. My youngest daughter is actually preparing to graduate from Columbia University Graduate School. So again, it's just such a wonderful time that we're here celebrating in so many ways. Education, those who help teach, so many things to celebrate. So be sure to turn off your cell phones, of course, or silence them. Let's enjoy this discussion together. Please welcome Jen Maxfield and Jamie Roth.
Thanks everyone for being here tonight in person and online. Hi, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that warm introduction, Kathy. Thank you all so much. And Jen, thank you. This is such an honor. Jen and I have been friends for a number of years at different stations, at Columbia, and I am so proud to be your friend and so proud of the work that you've beautifully done. So we'll get right into it. Let's talk about this book. First of all, how did the idea come to you?
So as you heard a little bit about in that wonderful introduction, thank you. I've been a news reporter for 22 years. And to give you a little background on what people like Jamie and I do in local news is we'll get an assignment for the story in the morning, and then we'll go out and we'll do interviews and we'll knock on people's doors and we'll make a lot of phone calls. And the photographer and I will put together a story that airs on the news that night. It's very rare that we spend more than a day on a story. And when it airs that night, it's also very rare that we would go back and return to the same story. And so the 10 stories that are in the book, what stands out about them to me, and they're all quite different. The subject matter is different and the people are very different, but I felt that these stories deserve more. For me, covering them for one day and meeting the people for one day just didn't feel like enough. And even though the live truck pulled away from the scene and their names faded from the headlines, I was still thinking about them. They made an impression on me. And in some cases, I was still even dreaming about stories that I'd covered in the past, maybe a decade or more ago. And so that gives you a sense of some of the ways that people impacted me as a reporter. And I wanted to go back and investigate not only what happened after I left, but maybe what happened before I got there and what it was like to be on the other side of this equation between the reporter and the subject of the news story.
why these 10? I know, I guess, or they got under your skin in a certain way. But a lot of stories will resonate, will stay with you, will linger. What was there a common denominator between these 10 for you?
I think the common denominator among the 10 stories featured in the book and the 10 people, the 10 families, is really the triumph of the human spirit. I'm sure you're all consumers of news in one form or another, and so you know that a lot of what we're covering is tough. And in some cases, we're with people on the worst day of their life, the most tumultuous day of their life, the most chaotic day of their life. But the benefit of hindsight that I have from doing these stories now, years after I initially covered them, is that we can put things in context. And the people who I write about are so inspiring and so hopeful because they have been through some of the worst of what life has to offer, but yet they've emerged triumphant. And in some cases, they've even pushed for social change or laws being passed. And they found happiness again after something happened to them that they never asked for. I mean, look, the people we interview on the news, they're not celebrities. They didn't ask to be in the spotlight. They were thrust in there due to circumstances beyond their control.
So you have this idea to go back because these stories live on with you. Was there like a eureka moment where you thought, I'm going to do this and I have to do this? Can you talk a little bit about that moment?
So I don't know if we have any writers or aspiring writers in the audience tonight, but I hope this is comforting information what I'm about to share, which is that the book looks very organized now, right? We've got the 10 people and the 10 stories and the individual chapters, but the truth of it is that it evolved organically, and I was writing one chapter and researching the next, but it isn't as though I had a very neat list of 10 stories to start and everyone had agreed to be interviewed. I want to acknowledge my good friend Kelly Reardon, who's in the audience tonight, and just as an example of how the book really took shape in real time. I had been already was about 4 to 5 months into writing the book. I probably had close to half of it done at that point. And I started thinking about a story that I had reported with Kelly when we were both students back in 1999 and 2000 at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. And it was a story about 2 men who had been imprisoned in a maximum security prison for more than a decade each due to first-time nonviolent drug offenses under New York's Rockefeller drug laws. The law has since been overturned. But I called Kelly and I said, did you happen to save anything from the documentary? I really want to go back to Chris and Terrence and write about them for this book I'm working on. And so Kelly, who's much more organized than I am, this arrived in a FedEx package 2 days later, and this is, I thought it would be interesting for people to see, but this is the source material for chapter 8 of the book, and I never would have been able to write it without Kelly. But I mean, just as an example, I mean, she saved the handwritten letters that we have, that we corresponded with these 2 men in Greenhaven Correctional Facility, and you could see my notes that I put on them. But yeah, it was really something to be able to go back to not only the original news stories and the material that Kelly saved, but I also worked with 2 research assistants, one of whom is an attorney. And that person also helped me. We filed many Freedom of Information Act requests, and we got 911 calls. So even if you know the original story and you recall it from seeing it on the news, there's information in the book that will be new to people because we just uncovered things that other people didn't because they moved away from the story and simply weren't covering it anymore.
Right. There are many emotional moments in the book. I was moved throughout. I felt joyful. I felt deeply affected. What about you in terms of going back to these stories? What was particularly moving to you? I know that the triumph of the human spirit you were saying, but specifically like one story in particular that maybe you didn't expect or something that surprised you.
I'm so glad you asked this question because I think after 22 years of news reporting. I have a good amount of self-awareness, and
I would agree with that.
I approached these families with a degree of humility because, and I'm so glad your book club is reading this, because I think this is a really interesting issue to talk about. Is I wasn't necessarily thinking that everyone would be so thrilled to see me again. I actually was wondering if I owed some of the people who I talked to in this book and who I researched for this book, did I owe them an apology? And I talk about in the book the moral ambiguity of what we do as TV news reporters. I mean, we insert ourselves into people's lives during these chaotic circumstances, and more often than not, people do welcome us into their homes and they say yes to the interview. But I was open to the possibility that some of the people that I've interviewed over the years might regret talking to me, might regret putting their story in the public eye. And I thought that would be interesting to write about also, and for people to understand some of the subtleties of what we do. And like I said, the moral ambiguity. And so we had some tough conversations with some of the families, even the ones who agreed to be in the book. And I do write about some of that. So that was one of the ways in which I approached people. And then the conversation that we had, it wasn't just about my covering them for the news, it was about being the subject of the news story. And for better or for worse, right? Because in some cases, they're exposing some of the details of their personal life to the general public. But in some other cases, there's no question that being featured on the news opened the door for a couple things. In the first place, it opened the door for the community to reach out and support people during some really tough times. And especially as the years went by, having their story publicized also opened the door for some real change to take place. And I would point to a girl named Zaina Madigan, who was 10 years old when she survived the Paramus, New Jersey school bus crash, which was a nationwide story. The kids were on their way to a field trip. These are 5th grade kids, right? And they're on their way to a field trip, and the bus driver, for reasons that still are hard to believe, basically tried to almost come to a stop and make a U-turn in the middle of I-80 in New Jersey. And the bus tragically was struck by a dump truck, and one of the children died, and one of the teachers died, and every single child on that bus and every single adult was badly injured in this horrible crash. And I think about Zaina, who I interviewed with her parents' permission, of course, a couple weeks after the crash. And she's 10 and she's in 5th grade, and she lost her best friend. And this child, with her parents, met with Governor Murphy at the State House in Trenton. She spoke before Congress less than a year after the crash. And it's because of this child that buses across the whole country are safer now, and stricter bus safety regulations are passed because of this child and her efforts. And she's going into her sophomore year of high school now, and I do write about her and some of the other kids on the bus in my book. And I just think that's one of the examples of a way in which you can open up your story to the public and really sort of take ownership of the story and take control of this thing that's happened to you.
If we can go behind the scenes for a minute, because a lot of times when reporters are covering these stories of bus accident or the worst day of someone's life, their child is hurt. I'm getting chills just thinking about it. Reporters have to roll up to these accidents or knock on a family's door. And you write about this in the book. It's something that you and I have both experienced. And you sit there in a live truck thinking sometimes, please don't answer the door. Please don't answer the door. But you have to go up and you have to knock because it's your job. And there's something important about getting this story out and giving people a chance to talk. Not only for, it opens the door to advocacy and it gets the story out, shares a perspective, can also be a catharsis for people. But can you talk a little bit about that moment, about how you wrestle with it when you're in the midst of it?
Yeah, it's without question the hardest part of the job. And that's why I titled the introduction, The Door Knock, and the conclusion, The Door Knock Revisited. Because I mean, I don't think there's a reporter out there that would tell you that there's a harder part of the job than going up to someone's door or approaching someone in person at a breaking news scene and ask them during this really tough time for them or their family to take a minute and to speak with us. And you're right, when I first started out in news, and even now, I mean, it takes me way outside my comfort zone. I do oftentimes hope that they won't answer the door or that they'll say no and it's just over, because I always take no for an answer. But over the last 2 decades, what I have learned and appreciate now more than I did starting out in Binghamton, New York back in 2000 is that people at a minimum need to be given the opportunity to tell their story. And as I said, more often than not, they do say yes.
Right.
And also, we as reporters, we are a proxy for the community. When we're asking the questions, we are trying to get the story to then share with the broader community. And so I always, if somebody says, I'm not interested, I don't want to talk to you, or slams the door in our face, and that's fine. But I do think that there is a human instinct to share your story. And in the case of a family who's lost someone, to also talk about that person, because that is the legacy of that person. For better or for worse, the public oftentimes will only learn about someone after they've passed or after something has happened to them. And so the stakes are really high when we're doing these stories, because in some cases, the story that we wind up putting on the air ends up functioning in some ways for the family, almost like a video obituary. And they'll wind up sharing our story. So you can imagine the pressure that we feel and the obligation to get the story right the first time. I mean, I say the quote in the introduction to my book, news is the first rough draft of history. And when you're getting a story done, and whether we have the full 8 hours or even an hour or two on a breaking news story to get it done before deadline, it is a rough draft. And eventually, certain things may need to be corrected, but we are putting out the first rough draft of history that we share with the public.
Right. And when you're talking with people who have suffered immeasurable loss, you just think to yourself, please let me do this person justice. Please let me get it right. Please let me not hurt them any more than they've been hurt. Just to bring in another side of your life, you're teaching at Columbia. Is there anything you tell your students about these particular moments? 19 and 20 and well, let's see here now. They're probably 22, 23, 24, our students. Yeah. Any good hints and tips that you give them about these very sensitive moments?
So Jamie and I both teach at Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. So you could probably answer this question too when you tell your students, but I'm the oldest of 6 kids, and my parents said something very frequently to us growing up, probably when we were fighting with each other, but just generally as advice. And they would say, treat other people the way you want to be treated. And that really is the mindset that I approach every person that I ask for an interview, every person who invites me into their living room, every person who agrees to talk to me on camera. And I really do try to approach them with the respect that I would hope someone would give to me in that situation. And then sometimes I'll say something to my students. I'll say, the way I view it is I'm a human being first and a journalist second. And that's a very clear line for me. But the more I reflect in the people who I know in the journalism business, a lot of us got into the business because we like to write, we like people, we like meeting new people and going to new places and learning new things from them. And so I think to be a good storyteller, which is really what we're doing as news reporters and what I'm doing in this book, I think to be a good storyteller, you do need to be an empathetic person. So I think being a good person makes you a good journalist because you're able to tell the story with a degree of empathy that gets other people to care about it. If I'm doing a story about a flood in Connecticut and I could rattle off 10 facts to you on the news, and that would take about 90 seconds, which is the length of a typical TV news story, you probably would be able to repeat 1 or 2 of the facts back to me in a day or 2. But if I took you inside someone's house and I showed you the waterlogged wedding album that they rescued from the basement. And we talked about that family and those people, and we interviewed them. You probably remember that for far longer, and it would make a far greater impact on you. And perhaps it would even move you to go donate items to people who had been victims of the flood. And that is really the power of storytelling, right? I mean, we have to get the facts out there. That's part of our role. But in order to really make an impact on the community, I think we need to be telling stories and be empathetic people to tell them well.
Right. The journalist that we both admire, Al Tompkins, he said or wrote or both that people often remember what they feel longer than what they know. And I find that that's true for myself, certainly in covering these stories. I'll remember the feeling as opposed to just the facts.
Well, that's what I remembered
Yes.
about these people.
Right.
I mean, that was what stuck with me. And that's why I went back to these 10 people, because of how I felt about covering them.
And I think one of the most extraordinary fruits of this labor is that these folks have felt really lifted up by your work. Jen's had some wonderful reviews from the people she's featured in this book on Goodreads. You've had them come to events. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that to me is the best outcome of this book. I mean, I hope everybody reads this and is touched by it the way I was. But the fact that you went back to these folks who you were with on the worst of the worst days, and that they feel that this book is a tribute to someone they love or an effort that they held dear, and they felt that you did them justice is really terrific. So
Yeah, it's been a rewarding part of writing the book. Number one, having the luxury of time, not having to rush out the door and say, thank you so much for speaking with me, but I'm really sorry, I need to go. I have to get the story on the air by 5 o'clock. But yeah, last night, for example, we had an event in Montclair at another amazing independent bookstore like this one, with a wonderful crowd, just like you guys who came out because they were engaged in the project. And two of the people who were there last night, one of them is featured in chapter 4 and the other is featured in chapter 5. And I told the audience there, the readers, a bit about, I don't want to give away too much, but I told them that these two people are survivors and that I had met them reporting their story initially, and that they were there with me as my special guest last night. And it was so amazing because as I described their stories and talked about the joy that I felt reconnecting with them, when the event was over and we were all done talking, everybody stood up and got their books, and people surrounded them and just saying what a pleasure it was to meet them and how they looked forward to reading their stories. And then when it came time to sign the books, Tamika and Gertrudis were asked to sign people's books too. And it just really made my heart sing to see them lifted up in that way. And as I said, the way they initially wound up on the newscast was pretty negative, and it was just amazing. You know, I had interviewed one of them 10 years ago, the other 11 years ago, and just to see the happiness on their faces of being a part of a project like this, that I think really honors them and gives an inside look at how we feel about the people we cover, that it's more than just a news story. It's more than just an interview.
And another chance for the community to connect with these people, with their stories. And it's really wonderful. And one of the quotes I love, I marked up the book.
Oh, that's fine.
Because
I consider that a compliment.
It is. But I love how you wrap it all up and you say, you mentioned moral ambiguity a few minutes earlier, but you say that knowing that we don't have total control is frightening and unnerving. The antidote is to enjoy every day and to be kind to each other. The moral ambiguity of what I do for a living only comes out on the positive side if the stories I write have the same ripple effect on you as they've had on me. And I think that is such a wonderful way of thinking about the work you do. And it's also a wonderful way of thinking about the legacy of your reporting, of reporting in general. So that's sort of my takeaway from this book, and it leaves me feeling really good. What is your takeaway from writing it? And then second part of the question, although we're not supposed to ask 2-part questions, one question at a time, violating the rules. Okay. All right. So question number 1. Question number 2, what do you hope the reader takes away?
All right, I'll start with the second part and then I'll go back to the first.
Yeah.
What I hope that you all feel inspired reading the book, and I hope that you feel hopeful and optimistic in hearing about stories where people have suffered in some way and have emerged stronger and more resilient than before, and reading about the journey and what got them to that place, because that's really what I took away from it. And I also hope that you get an insight into what we do, putting together those stories that you read about or listen to or watch on the news. One of the most common questions, not that other journalists ask me, but that I've been asked about the book is, oh, did you actually write your book? And I said, yes, I write my book. And I think part of that just speaks to a misconception about whether or not I even write my stories on TV, which I do. I work with a photographer and it's a team effort, but I do write the script and everything that I'm saying to when I'm speaking with people live on the news. So that I hope that people just appreciate just a little bit more about what goes into it and the process and the behind the scenes look at putting together a news story. And as far as what I took away from writing the book, I wrote this book during COVID, really during some of the most severe aspects of the lockdown that we all experienced. And it was a frightening time. I never worked from home. I continued to go in to 30 Rock to anchor the news, and I continued to go out and report stories. And I remember that feeling of dread with my 3 children and my husband. My husband was able to work from home, and feeling every day when I came home, like, am I bringing I'm the only person leaving the house for work. My kids were, learning at home on Zoom. I'm going to bring something home to them. And so just feeling that dread, and then, seeing on my calendar, okay, I've got an interview with Tamika tomorrow, or I'm going to speak with Zaina and her parents, and just having those people to look up to really in the process of writing the book and to feel inspired by was amazing. And I took a lot away from it. And I also found it to be a very humbling experience, because I think for everything that the people I researched taught me, and everything that they taught me, not just about their story, but just about life and how to handle things that come at you that you can't control. And so that's really, I hope you enjoyed reading the book as much as I enjoyed writing it.
I love that part of the job of reporting, what you learned from all of the people who are, who your path collides with. You would not have met otherwise.
Right.
And you get to ask them how they do it and how they think about it and what they've learned, what they know. And it's you pick up so much wisdom in all of these encounters, and it feels like such great fortune. And here you got to go back, which is it was a wonderful idea to do this work. I wonder too, if you could talk a little bit about your process, maybe both in terms of producing a story and then producing this story. So you talked a little bit about the daily work of a reporter, coming in the morning, you hit the ground running. You can just kind of take the folks here through a day in the life of a news reporter, and then talk a little bit about how that process was maybe sort of the skeleton for the process, but amplified a little bit for writing a book.
So the way that we report a news story, as we get an assignment in the morning. Well, first we pitch. Right, we pitch story ideas. So we give our colleagues at the station a few ideas, and then they might like one of our ideas, or they may say, actually, we had a different idea. And then that might be story A that you're assigned, but then story A could be changed to story B and maybe even story C based on whatever's happening. We had severe storms in New Jersey yesterday. So whatever most people were starting out with yesterday in the New Jersey, New York area, it had completely changed by 1 or 2 p.m. So as far as the writing, I'm accustomed to writing very quickly. The biggest difference, apart from length, right? Because a normal news story for us is about 90 seconds. It's maybe 250 words. The book is 70,000 words. So obviously there's the length of it, but the biggest difference in the writing is that when we write stories for TV, we know that you're watching the video. So I don't need to describe anything because you're watching it. When you're writing a book, of course, I wanted you to feel like you were in the scene, like you were with us and whatever was happening to the person I was writing about. And so that is obviously a different style. And when I would ask questions in interviews for the book that I would never ask for TV. So I'd say, of course I had more time, but I might say something like, tell me small details, even if you think it's insignificant and it's not relevant to the story. Share nothing, no detail is too small. And starting the interviews, I interviewed more than 70 people for the book. And so starting interviews with that mindset of, don't be afraid that this is an insignificant detail. There's no such thing as an insignificant detail. So something as small as one of the people I write about loved Burger King coffee and thought it was the best. I like that detail about him. And I thought that sharing something like that would make you feel like you knew the person a little bit more. And so, yeah, that was the biggest difference in the process. Though I would say that having been a day of air news reporter was helpful in writing a book because I am accustomed to writing in a moving van. So sometimes I mentioned I have 3 young kids. So sometimes I might have 45 minutes to write when my kids were at a dance class or when I'm waiting to pick up my son from soccer. I could take out my phone and make a phone call or do a little research. So I was accustomed to working in short bursts and not necessarily from home. So that was very helpful also. And I did try to write every day. And it doesn't mean I thought I was writing my best every day, but I always knew that if I got words down on paper, I could go back and edit it. And that did help me finish the project.
It can be very intimidating to see the blank page there and to know I got to throw something on this page. Is there anything that you do to just start the process?
Well, I mean, it's funny. I was talking with a friend today about this. I think writing fiction must be really difficult because there's no like source material.
Right.
I mean, I am starting with, this was a starting point. There's so much information. If anything, I did find it, I've always found it easier to write about a true story because the story actually happened. So I know the outline of the story and I have the material, but it's my job to make it interesting and to make it flow so that you are engaged. I mean, I've had some people tell me that reading my book, they felt like they were reading a novel or they felt like they were reading fiction. But I did have at least the skeleton of the actual story to get me started in each of these, which I found helpful.
You're flagging me.
I am.
Okay.
If you have one final question, that's great. And then we'll take some questions from the audience.
Wonderful.
Great.
Thank you. Advice for other aspiring writers and journalists. What would you say?
Just to get started and start putting words down on the page, because as I said, it wasn't until my book was maybe half done that I believed that it would actually happen, that it would actually get published, that I'd be able to finish it. But just do it. Take your idea. I mean, this was an idea that I'd had for several years. I had more time during COVID to work on it, which is why the book was written for the most part between the end of 2020 to the end of 2021. And just believe in yourself and the power of your story, because like I said, I mean, storytelling is such an amazing thing to do, and just get the words down on the page. And not every day has to be a great writing day, but you can still put the words on the paper. And one of the lessons I learned from reporting live news, look, I'm sure my initial efforts in Binghamton and Syracuse they were pretty rough. I
Wonderful.
sometimes say news that only a live shot only my parents could love. But sometimes I would finish a live report and I'd say, oh my gosh, that was terrible. I stumbled. I didn't know what I was talking about. And then I would go back and watch it later and I think, so bad, right? I mean, it felt worse than it actually looked.
Yes.
And I see Kelly nodding back there because I might point out,
Really bad hair.
well, that didn't help. So Kelly was also a local news reporter in Burlington before going on to her esteemed career as an attorney, which is why she saved all these wonderful things. She's very good at file and record keeping, right? But yes, so part of that also gave me the confidence that sometimes if we just quiet down that voice inside our heads that tells us that what we're doing is perhaps not good enough, actually what you're doing is great. And you can always go back and make a few edits or tweaks, but I found that also helpful to just think about that, even though it might feel uncomfortable and in the moment and like it's not your best, that you can do it.
Great.
Anyway, I'd love to take some questions from the audience here or the audience online.
Great. Well, such encouragement that you brought here to us in person and online. So I can grab the questions from online. Is there anyone here who has questions?
And if you have a question, please tell me your name first. Hi.
No question.
Yeah, hi.
Charlotte,
Hi, Shirley.
Charlotte,
Hi, how are you?
good. Did you ever write any negative stories? Or were all your stories happy ending?
Well, it is real life. And I would like to say that there's a hopeful note at the end of each of the chapters, but in some cases it might be too soon to tell. And because the people are in most cases still with us. And so, yes, I think every story has a hopeful message to it, but to say that it had a happy ending, I'm not sure it's totally appropriate in each of the cases because they're not fairy tales, right? I can't, it's real life and real life is that's just not always the way it works out. But that doesn't mean in my estimation, that doesn't mean that the people can't still find joy and share inspiration with other people, but I'm not sure I'd consider each of them happy. Any other questions about the book or just about process or news reporting in general?
So we have a question about what's next. So now that you've completed this book, would you consider another similar book or writing another book on a completely different topic?
We did one.
All right, well, this book has been out for 7 days. Probably a bit too early.
Get cracking, Maxfield.
Yeah. I have not started writing anything else other than my news stories because I am still working for NBC in New York. So I have not started any other book projects. Sometimes I will say I keep on the notes app on my phone. I always have a file that's essentially called random thoughts. And some of the ideas are better than others, but the book idea definitely was in there at one point. And so I'm always in tune with my own sometimes crazy ideas and sometimes I talk myself into them and sometimes I talk myself out of them. So this is what I talked myself into. And I did really enjoy writing the book, maybe more than I thought I would. So I wouldn't say no to a second book, but I certainly haven't started anything just yet.
Were there stories that did not work out for you to return to? And maybe just tell us one example of why.
Oh, sure. So, right. So there were a couple different categories. I had a quite long list of stories that I wanted to return to. And I'm glad that the person online asked this question. So obviously the 10 people who were featured in the book agreed to be interviewed, but there were people the other two groups of people, apart from the people who agreed to be interviewed for the book, were people who I was able to find and either said no or ignored my messages, right? I mean, I was able to reach out to some people on Facebook. I assume that they were the people I was actually looking for,
Right.
and they may just have never responded. Now, did they never check their Facebook or did they purposely ignore it? I'll never know because I just was never able to find them. And then there were also people who were impossible to find. I'm hoping that perhaps they'll reach out to me in the process of this book tour. But one good example is you may have heard about in Elizabeth, New Jersey, there was a series of bombs that had been placed in different communities in New York and New Jersey back in 2016. And one of them was placed in a garbage can right near the big commuter rail station in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And it would have hurt a lot of people had it gone off. But two men who were homeless at the time were walking past a garbage can. And one of them had a job interview the next day, a man named Lee. And so Lee looked in the garbage can and said, oh, there's a backpack that'll be perfect for my job interview tomorrow. And he picked it up, and the other person he was with, Ivan White, was a military veteran. And he opened it up and they saw the wires come out, and Ivan White said, that's a bomb and we're calling 911. And it was because of those two men that the bomb never went off and the police were able to destroy it, and they saved many people's lives. And it was an amazing story. And Ivan White sadly has since passed away since 2016. But I was never able to find Lee Parker. And Parker is a fairly common last name. And Lee did not have a permanent home at the time I interviewed him. And I made phone calls for months. I heard he had a job at the dairy company, and then I heard he moved to Philadelphia, and I'm calling different organizations who he might have interacted with, and I just never found him. And so I am sorry that I wasn't able to find him, because that was a story that always stuck with me. Those two heroes who found that bag and reported it. But, and then there were people who just said, no, thanks. And I write about an interview that I did on Zoom, and which has been something that we just started doing in the last 2.5 years. And I speculated about whether the fact that we had done the interview on Zoom and that I never sat with them in person, and I never actually looked in their eyes or even saw more than just a corner of their living room, if that created a less authentic and connection, and that maybe it was just easier for them to say no to me because they never really felt like they had bonded with me in the first place.
You could be,
Right.
you never know, but Zoom is wonderful, and yet you lose a lot.
You do. It's not a substitute. I mean, I think it's a great tool.
It is.
It allows us to interview people in different parts of the country. It allows me to reach more people tonight and for more people to hear our conversation who for one reason or another couldn't be here. So that part of it is great, but there's no substitute in my estimation for really sitting with someone and spending time with them. Yes.
Yeah, do you have an author that you admire, that you emulated, that you took clues from when you were writing your own book?
So I've always really loved narrative nonfiction. So like Truman Capote in Cold Blood is really, right, like that's a big figure in that genre. And I've enjoyed that. And I would also say that I've certainly enjoyed reading biographies and autobiographies about journalists who I've admired through the years. And I think a lot of those made an impact. And, you know, I point to people like Diane Sawyer and Judy Woodruff and just, you know, women who are out there really setting the tone for those of us who came up years behind them. And I read a lot of fiction too, actually. I think in some ways because of what I do for work, we all read for different reasons, right? Some people read to learn, some people read to be inspired, some people read to escape. And I think for me, reading has been something that took me away from what I covered at work. And so sometimes I think reading has been therapeutic for me to read fiction and to not necessarily think about real life stories, since I'm so immersed in them all day at work.
Perfect. Well, that's a great place for us to wrap up. We happen to have some of those book recommendations in Cold Blood, et cetera, right here in the store. And we also have the very new first book from our author. Thank you each for joining us, and thank you online for joining us as well. And we can continue a little bit of this question and answer and signing if you'd like to join us in the other room. But please join me in thanking Jen and Jamie for
Thank you everybody for joining, and for RJ Julia for hosting this great event. Thank you.
our pleasure.